TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies. And the lecture this evening is part of kind of an ongoing series of lectures and symposia that we're organizing in relationship to the events since 3/11. We had Paul Scalesi speaking about energy policy some time ago. At the end of November, Daniel Aldrich will also be speaking about some of these issues. And this evening we are very fortunate to have with us Andrew DeWitt. Andrew is a professor of the political economy of public finance at Rikyo University and the coordinator for the Asia Pacific Journal. He's also the co-author of The Global Financial Crisis, which was published by Iwanami in 2008. I'd like to draw your attention to the Japan Focus website, and you can see that there are a number of articles that he has written up here that deal with some of the issues that he'll be talking about today. So Andrew will speak for about a half hour or so, and we'll have an extended Q&A session. So I'd like you to welcome Andrew DeWitt.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you all for coming. And please forgive me, I'm going to have to read this. Trust me, it's better if I read it. I get lost all over the place. How do you get the slides? Thank you. Getting old, I forget words. Just the way it is. Okay, what do I?
Is the mic on?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's on.
I'll just get closer to it.
Thank you.
Right in your face.
I feel like a DJ or something. Okay. Yeah. Okay. The argument that I want to make in this talk, and this is going to be about. Sorry, I think Kyle said 30 minutes. It'll probably be about 40 minutes unless I really rush it, and that's probably not a good idea. So anyway, the argument that I want to make in this talk is that the earthquake, tsunami, and energy crisis in Japan have created an enormous opportunity to take the lead in the ongoing energy revolution, a smart energy revolution. I'll argue that we're watching a fight over which energy source, nuclear or renewables, will be the pillar of Japan's power economy. The fight between these contending energy sources remains very fluid and difficult to predict, but is associated with strikingly different infrastructure choices, political institutions, and ideas. I'll also argue that if renewable power generation does not become the main pillar of the emerging power economy, Japan risks forfeiting a significant and smart business opportunity. So there, my cards are on the table. All right. We all know how catastrophic the events of March 11 were. The earthquake and tsunami devastated the northeast region, killed over 20,000 people, and wreaked what appears to be about 20 trillion yen worth of damage. This is the most expensive natural catastrophe in human history. We also know that the meltdowns of the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi resulted in as yet incalculable costs, as well as an ongoing revision of Japan's basic energy policy. Japan's basic energy policy, adopted in June of 2010, commits it to producing 53% of its electricity by nuclear power as of 2030. A dramatic leap from the roughly 30% capacity prior to the crisis. The plan also foresees 14 new reactors. The long-range aim is to produce 60% of Japan's primary energy needs, meaning not just electrical power, by the end of the century. This is a profound commitment to nuclear power as the pillar of the power economy, as well as the energy economy in general. We all know that this commitment is underpinned by what is known as the nuclear village, a complex of public and private sector actors who agree on nuclear for reasons of profit, career, idealism, and the like. This nuclear village has received a massive shock from which it may not recover. It certainly appears that it will not recover the dominant position it held before the earthquake, a condition wherein nuclear power was largely accepted in the Japanese public debate as the only reasonable option, the pillar of the energy best mix, on the basis of economic, environmental, and security concerns. Nuclear was billed as the cheapest source of power, among the best for achieving a low carbon society and thus protecting the environment, and for achieving energy self-sufficiency. As we all know, the nuclear village is being challenged by the champions of renewable energy, most visibly in the aggressive moves by SoftBank CEO Son Masayoshi to organize local governments. Son was instrumental in keeping the feed-in tariff, or FIT, and I'm going to call it FIT from now on the policy agenda during the fraught months following March. Let me define the FIT. It's been adopted in over 80 countries and states, some cities as well. Supports roughly 75% of global solar and 45% of global wind, and has been deemed the most effective policy tool for diffusing renewable energy and ramping down its costs. The FIT guarantees a market for power produced by renewables and pays a premium price to reflect the currently higher cost of producing that power relative to conventional power. Some wind, by the way, is competitive with conventional power. So it's not all power, renewables that need subsidization. In any event, that guaranteed price, of course, represents a cost to the utility, which is compelled by law to purchase the power from a legitimate renewable power producer. But the FIT allows the utility to pass on that cost to the consumer, meaning households and businesses that consume electrical power. This allows the cost of shifting to renewable energy sources to be spread out over households and industrial sectors. I'll get back to this, but I want to go back to Son for a bit. By the way, if you're having trouble reading that, don't worry. I'll send this copy to Japan Focus, and you can read the slides if you like. Anyway, SoftBank's CEO Son helped pull the FIT out of the hands of the nuclear village. Actually, if you want to go to that site and look, I've got a couple of articles on the background of the FIT. I don't want to get into a big discussion of the FIT, where it came from and so forth here. Put you all to sleep. So if you wonder about its origins, etc., within the Japanese political context, please do have a look at articles that are already up there. Anyway, the nuclear village sought to use the FIT as a supplementary tool. Remember, they're committed to nuclear as the pillar of the energy economy. But they sought to use the FIT as a supplementary tool for ratcheting down dependence on fossil fuels. Together with former PM Kan, Naoto, Son got the FIT redefined in the public debate as a tool to lever renewables into the pillar position in the power economy, not only reducing reliance on fossil fuels, but also displacing nuclear power and eventually eliminating dependence on it. Now this is the key thing. I mean, the METI were going to use the FIT as their like trained dog, right? But what happens here is you get March 11 and the agenda for the policy changes. The FIT is critical in that it gives countervailing and powerful pecuniary incentives to those interests who would otherwise have inadequate incentives to act concretely on their concerns about nuclear power. I mean, they'd be worried about it, and so forth, but they wouldn't have any pecuniary, sufficient pecuniary incentives to mobilize and do things, which is like, do an energy shift. Anyway, let me return to this struggle between the nuclear village and the advocates of a green energy shift, a struggle that is now being fought out in fiscal and administrative institutions as each side tries to undermine the prospects of the other. Let me turn to the larger context of this fight and illustrate what I think are some of its implications. What is perhaps less well known about Japan's power market, as well as power markets in general, is that they're undergoing a so-called smart revolution. I mean, we all know that there's this thing going on about renewables and so forth, but there's this related but separate revolution going on. The revolution centers on mixing information technology with the power transmission grid. Consumers would be able to adjust, as it's written on here, this is smart meters, would be able to adjust their own power consumption and power production through apps on their mobile phones, for example, as well as other devices. Power companies would be able to monitor power consumption and power production in real time and very accurately, allowing them to handle the flux of power from renewable sources, achieve greater efficiency, and reduce the massive amounts of generating capacity needed to cope with peak demand. This interactive smart grid project has already seen the diffusion of smart meters take off, as written here, and become a serious industry. The smart grid is also being rolled out, here we are, especially in China. A great number of countries and leading firms such as Siemens, GE, Hitachi, Samsung, and the like are already testing various approaches in a bid to become the global leader that sets the global standards in this rapidly evolving market. But that isn't all. The smart grid is part of a larger development, generally referred to as smart cities or smart communities. We're going to fight. This all right. The common thread running through the smart city concept is one of a low-carbon and highly interactive urban design that helps humanity cope with rising energy demand and rapidly worsening environmental damage. Keep in mind that in 2007, 50% of the global population lived in cities, whereas cities comprise only 1% of surface area. By 2050, 70% of the global population is expected to live in cities. Cities consume 75% of energy, as well as release 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. I should say carbon dioxide emissions. So it is easy to understand why smart cities have become an enormously promising area of business, given the damaging volatility in conventional energy prices, the worsening geopolitical issues associated with conventional energy production, supply and consumption, and the rapidly worsening damage from global warming. Everybody here believes anyway. Believes in global warming, right? These threats and other pressures on the urban context are making resilient, low-impact urban centers not only attractive, but essential. The total scale of this smart city business, including smart water and other there's a lot of smart stuff these days. I had a slide. There's smart cheese. I don't know. But anyway, there's a little bit of concept stretching going on. But there are, especially where it comes to resources, the consumption and supply of resources. Smart is incredibly important. And it's a huge business whose, as I said, including smart water and other infrastructures, the business has been assessed at likely to grow to 41 trillion American dollars. Anyway, there is, in short, massive and disruptive change going on in power markets globally, as well as the urban context in which they supply power. These changes represent an enormous business opportunity. The various countries and city regions caught up in this revolution have strengths and weaknesses in terms of their capacity to take advantage of these rapidly emerging megatrends. Developed countries, for example, tend to have considerable sunk costs and deeply entrenched vested interests that make it difficult for them to develop and install smart grids and smart cities. These are projects whose innovative potential appears to be maximized via the development and diffusion of test models in real urban contexts. But on the other hand, the developed economies have enormous research capacity, financial resources, manufacturing capacity, and other assets that give them an advantage, perhaps, in the competition. By contrast, developing countries, especially the rapid developers, have rapidly growing urban centers and power markets that make it possible for them to leapfrog in certain aspects of building power markets in urban and other contexts. They are advantaged in having the opportunity to install the most advanced technologies and test them in the real context of rapid development. This affords them the opportunity to design technologies that are likely to become formidable competition in the global marketplace. On the other hand, developing countries are less endowed with research, financial, and other assets. unless, of course, they're China, which has not only the rapid development, but also extensive research, finance, and other assets, as well as a surprising charm, surpassing charm, pardon me, well, surprising as well, for such multinationals as Honeywell, GE, and many others. They keep getting ripped off, but they keep going back. In any event, Japan was seen as deeply handicapped in this ongoing competition, this larger competition. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry and other agencies were certainly not unaware of smart grids and smart cities, but they appear to have been handicapped through regulatory and cognitive capture by the utilities. In February of 2009, for example, the Vice Minister of METI went so far as to insist that Japan actually didn't need a smart grid. He said only the Americans do. You know, they have brownouts and blackouts and, you know, a kind of a weak grid, so they need a smart grid, but we don't need one here. Japan's monopolized utilities, now he was speaking as their mouthpiece, divided into 10 regional monopolies, were generally satisfied with the status quo of their highly balkanized and very inflexible power network. They were unwilling to innovate unless those innovations maintained the status quo that was so lucrative for them and their allies in the nuclear village. They understood that a truly smart grid would be a serious threat to their monopolies by, among other things, encouraging deregulation and the entry of serious competition. And so when Japan sought to develop smart cities, smart grid, and other kinds of test projects, their innovative potential appears to have been blunted by the potent role of vested interests in controlling their scope. I mean, you've got at the core of the test project the role of the utility that wants to guard its monopoly. Again, prior to the March 11 earthquake and tsunami and the ensuing Fukushima nuclear crisis, smart grids and smart cities were not seen as priorities for the Japanese political economy. The local electrical monopolies were not interested in putting in smart grids because it would simply give aid to the renewable producers that had long been trying to get access to the grid. This has been going on for a long time, as has been happening everywhere else. And they can also see what is going on overseas, with deregulation of power markets in places like Germany and Sweden, coupled with the rapid rise of renewable energy production and a tendency to erode the credibility of the nuclear alternative. But the nuclear village's conservatism, its risk aversion, is not particularly unusual. Utilities in the advanced countries in particular tend to have very conservative investors, such as pension funds, that want stable and predictable returns. Think about it. Utilities have massive capital investments that they have to depreciate over decades. And that is simply not a kind of business that encourages innovation. It is somewhat akin to the telecommunications markets before the emergence of the internet, mobile phones, smartphones, and other devices that have laid waste to the old model of the monopoly telephone network as well as the landline. I mean, there are lots of people who now don't even have a landline in their house, right? The creative destruction that took place in the telecommunications business saw highly regulated, inflexible, and generally very large firms find themselves ill-equipped to cope with disruptive change. Japan's utilities confront a similar challenge in the smartening of power networks and the diffusion of renewable sources of power production. That seems one major reason that we have such a pushback from the establishment grouped within the nuclear village, since their nuclear power source is the key element of the status quo business model. They want to preserve this model as much as they can, especially because it is crucial for paying off debt incurred for assets before March 11. Remember, TEPCO, the major utility, is 8% of the corporate bond market. So they want to take that business model because it's crucial for paying off debt incurred for assets before March 11, as well as compensation and other costs being incurred now. And we all watch this compensation package that is rigged and would probably blow up without maintenance of the status quo. If the nukes become stranded assets, how are they going to pay off the compensation costs and other costs? Japan was further handicapped from moving forward by the fact that it is an aging society whose population and economy are shrinking. It also has a very burdensome legacy of public sector debt from the collapse of the bubble economy 2 decades ago and successive policy failures afterwards. These and other difficulties have, it seems, made the entire society even more risk-averse than developed economies generally are, and thus unlikely to be the site for miraculous innovations in IT, power, urban design, and so on. One glaring handicap is the fact that, political handicap, the fact that older people tend not to, and I'm one of them, right? Now, tend not to welcome significant change in their circumstances unless those circumstances are unendurable. Yeah, sounds like me. And older people tend to vote in what they perceive to be their economic self-interest, a recipe for making urban innovation difficult. But in the wake of the natural disaster, well, and the human disaster, the debate over how to rebuild rejected the desire to see things return to pretty much as they were before the disaster, which of course a lot of the elderly residents of the Tohoku area were hoping for, and still are. There has been instead a focus on the opportunity as well as necessity of reconstructing in a smart way. The committees that studied the options for reconstruction were apprised of the ongoing revolution in urban forms and the power economy, and came down squarely in favor of smart and sustainable. Fukushima is emphasizing renewables, for example. And wouldn't you? So with the shock of March 11, an entire region's sunk costs were removed from the table. The devastated area is now becoming a test bed for advanced smart grid and smart city projects centered on renewable power. This redesign of the region also appears to be becoming a template for initiatives elsewhere. One of the most difficult challenges in Japanese public finance and administration over the past decade has been amalgamation of villages and towns. This initiative was aimed at reducing operating costs and shutting down communities that were too far removed from urban poles and being rendered fiscally and economically unsustainable by rapidly declining and aging populations. This initiative has seen the number of Japan's cities, towns, and villages decline from over 3,200 just over a decade ago to just about 1,700 at present. It has been even more difficult to build resilient and compact communities, which has been on the agenda of the national lands people and the general affairs people for some time. But suddenly, the devastation of an entire region is bringing forth a massive momentum into fiscal and administrative policymaking. In particular, it has injected considerable vitality into initiatives for green decentralization. This is prior to the Fukushima, prior to March 11. It's been going on for some years now. A vision of the present is on the left side and the future is on the right side. The present is where the regions are extraordinarily dependent on highly centralized governance structures and basically get the short end of the stick. And the right side is where where you have a green decentralization that gives them a better deal. Anyway, I don't want to try to explain that in too great detail. But anyway, it's injected considerable vitality into this kind of initiative, which focuses on bolstering local self-sufficiency and resilience, as well as incomes, by making them, the local communities, more diverse suppliers of power and other commodities to urban centers. The number of villages has declined and continues to do so, but the nuclear village remains prominent. It's still a very potent force in Japanese power politics. It unites the influence of administrative agencies, power unit manufacturers. Power unit manufacturers, I mean, things that, machinery that creates electrical power, thermal, nuclear, renewable. These are like power unit manufacturers like Toshiba, Hitachi, and Mitsubishi. Financial interests that have invested heavily in expensive assets. And don't forget these people. They're fighting right now to make sure that taxpayers and ratepayers of the utilities bear the burden. They don't want to take haircuts, even though they invested in risky assets. They want to pass the cost on to everybody else. They're part of the nuclear village, and they don't get enough attention. We should give them attention. Financial interests that have invested heavily in expensive assets, another interest. The institutions that underpin the nuclear village are diverse. Here's a couple of, this is from the book, but the guy's become famous now, Oshima Kenichi, professor at Ritsumeikan University. And he did these calculations, on power costs. And anyway, in his book, in English, the title is The Political Economy of the Green Revolution. He has he's got nice laid out chapters. He's got summaries of how much subsidization was going on. And you can see, for example, here, the share of total fiscal support for energy in Japan from public budgets and what it was devoted to. Oil and coal, of course, weigh in there heavily. This is a legacy investments, of course, from 1970, right? But look at the amount of subsidization that has gone into nuclear, as opposed to renewables in particular. Here's another one. This is local allocation tax shares. The local allocation tax shares, I mean, I teach it, but I don't want to teach it here. Local allocation tax is a mechanism of fiscal redistribution between the central and local governments. The center takes monies from all around the country, pools them, and then distributes them. Anyway, how much of the local allocation tax was spent on power sources, and within that you can see the relative amounts devoted to the various kinds of power generation. So anyway, these are institutions that underpin the nuclear village. It also includes public finance that underwrites much of the cost of building reactors, as well as developing the technology for the so-called self-sufficient plutonium economy, that's to recycle nuclear material. It also includes the public sector guarantee in the event of accidents and so forth, which we see coming in action now. The institutions are also very much centered in the central government. National energy policy, including the regulatory and fiscal tools to foster the industry, is determined by relatively few actors. You're getting more participating in policy making now. This makes sense, as nuclear power generation is a highly centralized kind of power technology. Nuclear reactors are in the gigawatt class, or at least hundreds of megawatts class of power production, and are often grouped together for efficiencies in terms of transmission, as well as the politics of not in my backyard and other reasons. The grid that takes the power and delivers it to centers of consumption is part of the infrastructure that underpins this complex of interests, institutions, and ideas. In political economy terms, a relatively small number of actors is fostered and dominates a power market worth about 16 trillion yen. On top of those annual income flows, there are the massive opportunities for power unit manufacturers, as a given nuclear reactor construction project can cost in the multiple billions of dollars. And of course, as we all know, they're getting more and more expensive. Time goes on, and they will get more expensive now because of the requisite safety guarantees. Remember, after the accident, there was the METI was going to guarantee that by 2030 and 2050, between 2030 and 2050, that the safest nuclear power in the world. That's going to cost more. Anyway, this is highly concentrated benefits with the cost diffused among utility ratepayers and taxpayers. So where are we in this struggle? We have an emergent vision of a smart rebuild of the devastated region. I explained to you, that's going on. Also, organized by SoftBank's Son Masayoshi, fully 35 of Japan's 47 prefectures have signed on to a drive for renewable energy in his Renewable Energy Council. They are also organizing linkages, by they I mean the local governments, organizing linkages among themselves at the regional level, looking for broader renewable opportunities. And Tokyo Metro, which is not part of Sun's group, is keen on building its own power capacity, and hence is ready to press for deregulation of the power economy. A larger constellation of private interests is more or less strongly allied in this effort. Not just SoftBank, but NTT Docomo, Mitsui, and other firms have announced their intentions to enter the power generation business, taking away some of the lucrative gains currently monopolized by the nuclear village. Many firms in renewable energy equipment, construction, finance, and other sectors are also looking forward to benefiting from renewables. They were interested in the FIT before March 11 and are even more so now. If you looked at the trade journals late last year and early this year, there's a considerable number of articles on building things like, a new model in construction firms that would, cover all aspects of designing, constructing, and operating renewable power facilities, for example. Construction firms are really hungry, looking for business, right? Also among the nuclear village's antagonists are other bureaucratic agencies in the central state, such as the Ministry of Farms, or rather Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forests, whose areas of jurisdiction have been ravaged by the meltdown in energy policy. These agencies want a seat at the table, and particularly MAF, wants a seat at the table determining new energy policy, where they can represent farmers and other interests whose livelihoods have been severely damaged and who would benefit from the distributed economic opportunities of an energy shift driven by the FIT. Now remember, part of the strategic, the economy's strategic growth polls was, the export of agricultural goods. Well, good luck, So that's one cost of this March 11 meltdown of energy policy. So of course these other agencies want to get in there. Other ministries, including METI itself, are keen to secure budget appropriations aimed at fostering research and investment in renewables. This is going on now. Thanks to SoftBank's son and former PM Kang, as well as the debate on reconstruction, many of these actors, but certainly not many, appear to be uniting behind deregulating the power sector, building the smart grid, and getting a robust FED. These policies are aimed at encouraging the deployment of renewables and thus distributing power generation opportunities across regions and socioeconomic groups. We also have an ongoing deconstruction of several of the fiscal and regulatory supports of the nuclear village. Public sector investment in the long-range goal of building the nuclear economy is being retracted. The rethink of the basic energy plan is also being done in a committee. Here's a little thing from the Asahi newspaper. It's got this is the membership of the committee. And the blue, let me put my glasses on. The blue are the, should have brought that article. Oh, here it is. Natsugenpatsu. The blue are the people who want to get out of nukes. The yellow is unclear. And the red, this is the age structure of the committee. The red are the pro-nukes. And so if you can't read it from the back, it's 41 to 45 years of age, 46 to 50 years of age, 51 to 55 years of age, and they're on. And over 70 is the last on the right-hand side. Anyway, the rethink of the basic energy plan is also being done in a committee that has 8 pro-nuke members, 8 anti-nuke members, and with the remaining 9 being neutral or at least not declared. who knows, this committee started its deliberations from, I think I've written it there, from October the 3rd. And you know, they'll fight, they'll fight over energy policy for over the next long while. And yet we still don't know how generous will be the levels of support from the Fed, whose revised version is slated to become effective from next July. The law was passed, given assent, pardon me, in August 26th, but there are various provisions of it that remain undecided. One is price-setting functions, feed-in tariff. You know, you've got these levels of subsidization for various sources of power. Who's going to decide how much, for example, wind should get, how much geothermal should get? Well, those price-setting functions were taken away from METI and turned over to third-party advisory agencies, whose membership is yet to be decided. Considerable bureaucratic action centers on getting loyal people into these committees. That's what they're all fighting about now. You have a 5-member committee. Well, how many are going to be METI people? How many are going to be, et cetera, right? Anyway, moreover, it's yet to be determined how reconstruction expenditures will be rationalized and guided, because the reconstruction agency is yet to be put in place. I told you they're taking all these budgetary appropriations, and you've been reading in the papers, all this money has been, you know, come through now the 3rd supplementary budget. How is all of that money going to be spent? Well, the Reconstruction Agency is a new agency in the government. It will be in operation from what appears to be January of next year, thereabouts, maybe March. Anyway, they're hastily putting it together. The agency will be constituted for a period of 10 years. The agency's direct head will be the Prime Minister, with a cabinet-level officer in charge of the administrative end. The agency will be empowered to render binding decisions concerning the allocation of expenditures and other matters in the area under reconstruction. The staffing and advisory roles in this new agency are very likely to be critical matters for shaping the character of the reconstruction of the devastated region's power economy, as well as the way the power economy interacts with urban design and other critical functions. It would appear, excuse me, that within the governing party, the governing Democrats, well, they say they're governing, but you know, the retreat from nuclear is already understood as common sense. Perhaps that's why the investments in infrastructure for achieving the designs of the current basic energy law can be backed away from without causing a great deal of controversy. What remains to be decided is how much of the existing nuclear plant can be restarted. No politician wants to act quickly on this, as none can be sure that an effort to push restarting the reactors, remember they developed a stress test, right? You're going to do the stress test, and push restarting the reactors, you never know, you might get embroiled in a new scandal, a new accident, right? Or some other unforeseen risk. Although the business community, through its major peak associations, especially Kate Anran, right, is committed to pushing for restarts, politicians face a very different set of incentives. The business community has insisted that companies will leave the country because of uncertainty about the power supply, but this argument does not appear to be gaining much traction, as most people are aware that the rising yen and other issues are driving the hollowing out that is occurring. The fight over nuclear versus renewables will go on and on, with various victories on either side. You know, for example, in the committees to decide on the relative pricing, the real pricing of energy, of the respective power generation sources. That's all being redone, right? Because they discovered that in the first meeting of the committee that Can struck in the summer, they discovered that they were using data from 2004. Well, you know, it's 2011. You're talking about the energy economy of the third most significant economy in the world, right? You know, energy is 10% of an economy, and you're using data that's 7 years old in some cases. Some of the other data wasn't that old, and very suspect as well. So you've got a committee studying what the various real costs are. Well, you can imagine how they're fighting. So there are fights going on in all kinds of committees like that. Who wins the war depends on price setting in the Fed. This is a very important thing. How much the energy shift is incentivized. Deregulating power and building a national and international grid. Now I want to have a look at this. This is not rocket science or radical. This is what they're doing in Europe. There's a northeast, in the North Sea, there's a grid being slated for construction. It's about 400, I think it's 400 billion euros. And then you've got the Desert Tech project. Please do have a look at this stuff. This is fascinating stuff. The Germans inside their own domestic economy now that they've decided they're going to pull out of nukes, and they really got to move on some of these projects that were there, but just didn't have sufficient political momentum and didn't have a sufficient, what would you say, a sense of panic. Like, we got to get this done. For example, linking their wind sources with their centers of consumption. Linking that with a smart grid network domestically. All of those things are starting to move at surprising speed. The Germans are also talking about linking up with Spain, which is in dire straits. The Germans' finance minister in June said, geez, it would be great if the Spanish could sell solar power, but just in the midst of some kind of negotiations. And now you have just in the past few weeks a delegation of the high-ranking German officialdom and private sector investment going down to Spain to look into what's called Project Helios, to build multiple nuclear reactors worth of solar power on about 20,000 hectares of old coal mine areas, and sell that. Those are the kinds of things you have going on. And you have this proposal here that has been kicking around for some time within Japanese circles and elsewhere, about linking up the Asian region in a way that the Europeans have already linked their energy economy is already linked, and they're thinking of extending their energy, their electrical network down into MENA, the Middle East and North Africa, supplying maybe 15% of European power through facilities down there. And this is hotting up. We're in an enormous financial and etc. crisis, so we really, really need smart Keynesianism. And nothing pays off like investing in infrastructure. That is the backbone infrastructure of the next economy. So that's happening over there. And should we do it here? Well, Son Masayoshi went over to Korea, I think it was in May, and talked to the Koreans about, building a grid that links Korea. You don't see the links in here. Link Korea with Japan, which like a year or two ago, a totally radical idea, but it's no longer radical. This is now championed by the IEA. The former head of the IEA, Tanaka Nobuo, has been making this argument wherever he can, that not only do you need a domestic grid network, a super grid that that Son and other actors are proposing, but you should be linking the grid to Korea, Russia, China as well. Anyway, smart Keynesianism. Things that hitherto were unthinkable or just too radical are now becoming, we'd better do this. Anyway, the more triumphs scored by the Greens, or the champions of renewable, and the greater the compression from collapsing external demand. Remember, Japan is heavily reliant on external demand.
the greater the impetus to move towards renewables and the requisite infrastructures. It becomes, building the national grid, which the utilities opposed. They're weakening, and the need has become, undeniable, objectively undeniable, and so you probably move in that direction. However, these are things you should be doing, but that doesn't mean that they'll be done, right? However, if the nuclear village were to prevail in their effort to restart all their assets, we may see the problem of public distrust and its implications for spending worsen. In a context of already flat incomes, weak domestic demand, and rapidly weakening overseas demand, and remember, we're moving into a double dip. It's almost certain. How bad it gets is not a laughable matter. How bad it gets just remains to be seen. The Europeans are meeting, what is it, on the 23rd of this month, whether they can get a bailout package together, and even the last one they agreed on has not yet even gone through. The Slovakians are bringing up objections, and it's a madhouse. Anyway, so in that context, I think for the people, for the nuclear village to win would be very bad for this country. This country would have increasingly costly, potentially cul-de-sac power, and little impetus for growing into green. I'm making this assumption. See, I can't prove this yet, but I think the more nukes you have, the less. You got that, that baseload power running all the time. The less incentive you have to move quickly, like the Germans did. It's striking how rapidly the Germans have moved on some of these things that, we should do it. Well, now we've got to do it, right? You see this happening. And so, in this context, in this national context, I think you have a similar kind of potential incentives operating. That's why I've laid out these are questions. What are the role of the things we don't know, things that are happening now? The role of the committee studying these issues, we don't know what's going to happen there. The staffing of the FIT advisory committees, we don't know what's going to happen there. Is METI going to get a lot of its yes people onto these committees? We don't know. Probably not, but you never know. The role of the reconstruction agency, we don't know. That remains to be seen. What happens in a rapidly worsening economic crisis? Does reason prevail? Who knows? What's reason anyway, right? How many nukes get restarted and to what effect? Like I said, possibly ignite a good deal of distrust in an already very distrustful public. And what effect does that have on their propensity to spend? We don't know. And how smart does Japan get? Well, if you don't have these strong incentives, are you going to, pursue some of these opportunities? If you are compelled to shift, like the Germans, more into renewables, then you have to put in some of this infrastructure that then leads to innovating as rapidly as you can. For example, Siemens, they pulled out of making nukes, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago, right? Now they're committed to pursuing renewables, and they're very heavily involved in these smart grid, smart city designs. Siemens, a quarter of Siemens' R&D budget is now devoted entirely to green, right? It's looking at that as a mega trend that it wants to take advantage of. So we have that, but where the proper balance between the nukes and renewables, where you just strike that balance is, that's anybody's guess. And that's something we're going to find out. Anyway, I went over time. Pardon me. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'd be interested in your questions. If I could ask for your cooperation on how we do this. We're videotaping this and we're podcasting this. And for that reason, we need to ask you to come to the podium to ask your questions, as tedious as that may be. And also, I need to say that because this is going to be broadcast, if you do not want to participate in that, then I guess you'll have to let us know so we can erase your section off the tape. Perhaps if you want to speak but you don't want to be on the video, which is understandable. And also if it's a sensitive issue that's off the record, you could wait till the end and we can block the people who don't want to be recorded at the very end. Okay, so don't be shy, but please do come this direction if you have questions.
Thanks very much. That's extremely interesting. Scott Foster, analyst from BNP Paribas. Quite interested in what you were saying about the Japanese officials suddenly becoming interested in linking the power grid here with the grid in Korea. Looking at what's going on in Germany, we see that they're importing nuclear power from France and the Czech Republic, and the Czechs are actually planning to build more nuclear reactors in order to supply Germany. So is the motivation here simply to link up with Korea so that Korea can be Japan's nuclear power plant? And Korea is heavily nuclear, and so nuclear that you can probably never get out of it. What's the motivation here? Shut down your own nukes and use someone else's?
I know that argument, and I don't want to speak for the German Environmental Agency and so forth, but they have written a rebuttal to the argument that well, you know, look at the Germans. They say they're going to back out of nukes, but they're going to import nuclear power from, as you say, from France and so forth. They have a fairly persuasive, like I said. I mean, yeah, there's no area of expertise. I really don't have an area of expertise, but if you read their argument, they're not reliant on nuclear power from France. And I mean, there's so much of a fight going on between these interests. You know, the global nuclear lobby, the global nuclear village, if you will. You know, and the champions of renewables at the global level. I mean, they're united in things like the International Renewable Energy Agency, right? And they develop their own narrative of what this incident means and so forth. The nuke people, of course, have, you know, an industry they want to protect. It's received possibly its worst shock ever. So, oh, look, the Germans, you know, what they're doing, this is, you know, the Merkel, she shifted position, you know, she's just doing it cynical, which I think is, geez, you know, I mean, you look at the deliberative democracy that went on in Germany that led up to this decision on what to do in terms of, you know, whether to get out of nukes or not. That was striking in how much that society was involved in this decision. So the idea that it was a, you know, cynical thing from Merkel, it seems to me an exaggeration, and in line with that, you get this exaggeration. Well, the Germans aren't really pulling out of nukes because they're going to get, you know, power from the French. Well, you know, look at the documents, and you know, make your decision on the basis of that is my advice. And now, the linkage between you know, Japan and Korea. The argument that's being made, for example, by the former head of the IEA, Mr. Tanaka, you know, he's not saying, look, you know, let's do this so we can, you know, import nuclear power. And I don't think that is. I mean, I'm almost certain that that's not the objective of somebody like Son Masayoshi, because if you do that, well, then you sort of put his business model in disarray. You know, whether that eventuates, you know, if you build the infrastructure and then domestically, you know, you have, you know, you have, you know, an inadequacy of power generation because, you know, you don't get adequate finance because of the nature of the nuclear village structure. The financial institutions aren't willing to lend, even though you have a fit. They won't create financing packages for producers. I mean, it's unlikely to happen, but let's just, hypothetical. And you had inadequate power, and then it eventuated that you would have to rely on Korean nuclear power. Well, that would be tragic, but I don't think that that's anybody's objective. I haven't seen that argument made. I've seen a lot of arguments made about, questioning SoftBank's son's motivations, being pecuniary and therefore suspect. But no, I don't see that. And why would you? Why would you, mobilize and push for that kind of project with that idea in mind? Doesn't seem sensible.
Well, just watching what's going on in Europe, and of course you wouldn't say that, but the actual result could be that. But I'm more interested in issues of scale. So around Japan, there are several mega solar projects, but most of them are 1 to 5 to 10 megawatts. Most of them 1 to 3. I think the biggest one is 13. But there's a proposal now, I believe somewhere near Hamaoka, for a 50 megawatt project. And talking to Toshiba, I got the impression that they think that with the new government support for renewables, this will enable them to take what were essentially pilot projects and scale them up to something that's economically realistic, considering the power requirements of Japan. Could you address that?
Are you asking if I mean...
So are we going to see a lot of 50 megawatt mega solar projects?
You're wondering whether it's going to be distributed power or a centralized power?
No, I'm curious, are we going to move from having several 1 to 10 megawatt solar power stations around the country to 50 megawatt or 100 megawatt, much bigger ones that could actually replace a lot of power that's now coming down the routes?
That depends on how you structure the FIT. And this is why the FIT, again, is a critically important device, because you can foster distributed small-scale power, which can be very effective. I mean, the Germans are leaders in this. Most German solar is, as you know, small-scale, rooftop stuff. And in that, if you do it that way, then you distribute economic opportunity. However, if you could structure the FIT in such a way that you put disincentives in the way of small-scale producers and favor large-scale producers, and that's always a risk, because it's a political device, right? I mean, which groups are you going to subsidize? Well, the vested interest, geez, we don't believe in solar, we don't believe in whatever. I've been arguing that for years and years, right? And then, the game changes. You got this new policy, and it's robust, and well, let's shape it to our own advantage. That's a conceivable kind of, political outcome, and it would be, it would be a tragedy if that were to eventuate. Because one of the key, issues in our time, of course, is inequality. Like Occupy Wall Street and stuff like that. I mean, we really would be a tragedy to get an energy shift going on, and you reproduce or exacerbate, the inequality of the present energy economy, financial economy, etc. And that is a very potent possibility in our present, and something we should be, very aware of, instead of arguing constantly. Geez, I wonder if that renewable, it's just too costly. It's never going to go anywhere. Renewable energy has a wonderful future and always will be, as those kinds of slogans they rattle around in the public debate. Well, geez, this is happening. The Germans have ramped up their electrical power production over a decade from 6% renewables now to over 20%. They're going to blow through their next targets. 2020 is 35%. They're rocketing up there. That's happening in other places around the world, happening in China. The speed with which China is putting in place wind solar and others. You know, I mean, you saw in there the smart grid projects are very heavily weighted in China. That links together, you know, all these regions, renewable energy production. It starts to, ramp down costs, raise efficiencies, and so forth. Now, whose capital is that going to become? Whose revenue streams? Is that going to be even more, centralized, inequitable than the current energy economy, which is dominated by things like ExxonMobil and so forth? That would be horrible, right? And so, if there's anything that I want to emphasize in this talk, it's that, geez, this mechanism, the feed-in tariff, is an important deal.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Alex Luca. I'm a PhD candidate at the Tokyo Institute of Technology and also a freelance analyst for Thomson Reuters on Japanese energy and climate policy. Lovely talk. Very glad to have finally met you in person. I've read your stuff already lots of times, so very glad to be here and see you in the flesh. I would like to ask maybe it's a two-part question basically, and I'll make it very brief though. At the beginning of the talk, you were saying that a nuclear village had lost some power, but towards the end of the conversation, or the presentation, you mentioned that it remains potent. And that's, I recognize that, and I'm trying to come to grips with how to conceptualize this in my own analyses. I'm trying to find out essentially where this fight that you're talking about is taking place. I have seen the debate that occurred on October 3rd, and maybe for those in the audience who haven't seen it, it's essentially 30 people who each take their turn to talk within the space of 2 hours. They didn't get much beyond the ISATs, the hello, how are you, this is my position stage. And even if this process were to go on for a couple of months, I really, really doubt that that's genuinely the place where the actual discussion is taking place and the actual fight is occurring, because simply you don't have time to structure your argument in the amount of time that is allotted to you. So I would like to ask of you, first of all, if you can tell me where, in what backrooms or in what committees this actual fight is occurring. And the second part would be, is if you can evaluate to what extent this hit that the nuclear village has taken is going to last, because we see lots of action locally against nuclear power across a number of prefectures like Fukui and so forth. But you also see Hokkaido, who relaunched their nuclear reactor recently. And if the townships derive a lot of money, budget-wise, from the fact that they have nuclear power plants on site, their mayors and the local assemblies can say, yes, I'm opposed to restarting my plant. But they can say that until the budget runs out for this year. What happens next year? Will we just see a resurgence of power of the nuclear village by the back door of the local budgets? In my opinion, it is too early to say that they've been struck a decisive blow. Until we actually see what happens next year with township budgets and with the restarts, I think we should hold our horses before we draw a conclusion. I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I agree with you that, for one thing, in your comment, you're right. There are 30 members on the what is it, the Natural Resources Committee studying the new energy policy. Sorry if I misled anybody. The chart that I used in there has 25. These are the 25 new members, and the split among the 25 new members is 8 pro-nukes, 8 anti-nukes, and 9 uncommitted, and there are 5 on the other. So the weighting of the thing is. But as you argue correctly, I mean, the committee is not going to single-handedly determine the future orientation of energy policy. One of the who knows how this is going to work out over the next while. The former PM Khan tried to make it an election issue, right? That was what he was trying to work towards. And that didn't eventuate. And so you don't have any clear consensus, that's arisen on what to do. You have all these actors mobilized, the financial actors. They don't want to take, they don't want to take haircuts on their investments. They don't want to see those nuclear reactors become stranded assets because then the extant utilities, they wouldn't be able to pay off their debt. So, they're applying pressure through various means. The political class is, within the LDP, there's a split. You've got Kono Taro arguing vociferously. You've got others kind of, they took the price-setting mechanism, in the feed-in tariff, they took that out of the hands of METI. So they acted in a surprisingly progressive way for the reasons of possibly, appealing to local producer interests, like farmers and so forth. But on the other hand, from a particular political perspective, are retrograde in other dimensions, and so it's really hard to see, what is going to be the determining factor. Very likely you're not going to have some kind of, you're going to have some explicit commitment made in a new energy basic law. How that slices the issues, what the eventual determination of, what should be the relative weighting of nuclear versus renewables, et cetera, and if power efficiency, energy efficiency, and so forth. That remains to be seen how that happens. And so it's difficult to project that, except to say that you have a multiplicity of actors that are that are heavily involved in this, that are influential in this, which is considerably different from the situation that prevailed just over 6 months ago, where energy policy was dominated by METI and its client interests. And so you can see through that, that you've got so many wild cards at play here that you can't project it. It's interesting. What else can you say? This very interesting question, very, illustrating all the, that there are a number of variables at work here. And all I can say is that I agree with you, and that it is going to be very interesting to watch over the coming months and years how this is resolved. Who would have, for example, if you look comparatively in the German case, it seemed that the Germans had reached some kind of decision in the American government, not so far long ago, about, we're going to maintain nuclear, in this fashion. And Fukushima happens and things change. So, who knows what's next? But thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mark Elder. I'm with the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies in IMF, and I'm a fellow political scientist. And so I'd like to ask a kind of political science question. Is one thing that seems very bit odd about this is I'm wondering why at least in the past, the utilities were somehow more politically powerful than the electronics companies, and why some of the electronics companies and the heavy machinery companies who could just as easily have done renewable energy, because they could do either nuclear or renewable, or both, but why they were leaning in that direction too. Why some politicians were favoring nuclear over renewable, and even within METI, actually there was a division. So there's a big faction in METI that's the kind of nuclear faction, but there was another faction, and which was pushing for electricity industry deregulation, and they almost won actually, but they didn't. So anyway, there's, as a political science, there are kind of a lot of these odd aspects. I wonder if you could address those.
Well, thank you for throwing that into my lap. But how do you explain, why they're Panasonic and Sharp and those firms there, Mitsubishi, they make some of the finest geothermal stuff in the world, and this is a prime area for geothermal development. Why haven't they tried to, put a lever in there and, and get some action going? Why have they been, allowed the public debate, for example, to say that, geothermal, it would probably be nice to do it, but the onsen owners are against it. Well, it's just not the case. Not all of them are, right? And, et cetera, et cetera. There's ways to work out deals. And why hasn't that kind of, political energy been invested domestically? Well, I think because, in some cases they were, if you're the solar producers and so forth, you've got overseas opportunities. It's just not worth it to fight, tooth and nail in the domestic context. You know what's going to happen. You're just going to bang your head against a wall. The degree to which Kate Amron was anti-FIT is just mind-boggling. I've heard stories about how somebody tried to do a talk on FITs. This is now like a few years ago in Kate Amron, and it was just like, no, that's not going to happen. Don't go to it, right? And so there was inside the Kate Amron head office, the talk was held. The other member companies' staff, the representatives rather, were advised not to go to it. And then some of them, this is big in Germany and big around the world. We should know about this. And they, in spite of being warned not to go, went in anyway. And then apparently, inside the meeting, received phone calls, get out of that room, right? It's just, the degree of opposition to anything like that is startling, and the willingness of whom you would think would be powerful within that organization, the willingness of those actors to accept that the domestic market is basically just going to be a trickle, right? Just a trickle. Renewable energy is going to be basically only solar, and it's only going to be fostered to this extent, which, even though they have overseas access, access rather to overseas markets, that's risky, right? You might be like in Canada, where the Ontario people put in a feed-in tariff and made a provincially sourced, supply a condition, and so forth. You got those kinds of trade barriers going up, and so you would think that they would want to make more use of the third biggest, power economy in the world. But I think that's indicative of how powerful those carbon-intensive interests are within Kate Amron, and how powerful the utilities are. Remember, the utilities are regularly the vice chairs of Kate Amron. So that's one. They were partially satisfied with their access to overseas markets, and also just deterred by the. From one political perspective, the blockheadedness of vested interests in the peak association. Does that answer the question? Is there another aspect to it? wandering around in there. Because it's been, actually, I'm really, thank you for asking that, because it tells me, it's an interesting question in its own, but it also tells me that what I've been scratching my head about for a couple of years now is something worth scratching your head about, and investigating in as much detail as possible.
Don't hesitate to come up with an answer. Please do come.
Hi, yeah, I'm James Brown. I'm a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen. My question relates to gas, actually. It strikes me that you didn't really say very much about that. And irrespective of what Japan does in the long term, it seems that it has a short and medium-term problem. We know that in the case of Germany, that it's very likely that they'll have to increase their supplies of Russian gas. And given that gas is also a tried and tested technology, I think I'm right in saying that gas plants are some of the cheapest to build. LNG prices are quite reasonable at the moment because of the explosion in shale gas. Sorry, it's a kind of bad but yeah, so I mean, really, how do you see the role of gas in Japan's future energy policy?
This is critical. In fact, if when I originally started writing this, it was the 3 power sources, right? The power generating sources. Because you really can't do this without talking about gas. Because gas is, you've got this fight going on between the nukes and the renewables, the representatives and the interests, the ideas, the institutions. And up in the middle is, gas is rising up. There's a very powerful gas lobby. And there are huge dimensions to this. I mean, there's infrastructure that would have to be put in place, and that might become perceived as a very sensible option in the event of an economic crisis. Oh, geez, we can't get the nukes restarted. Renewables are, medium to long term, and in the short run, this is gas. Look, the Americans are producing an enormous amount of gas. We can bolster our ties to the United States, who like a few years ago, the Americans exported gas. Forget it, not going to happen. And now this is, this seems to be in the cards as a result of what, the CIRA and other agencies call the golden age of gas. The IEA is also put out. You're not in the gas industry, right?
No.
Oh, yeah. It's just sort of, got to had it in.
Department of Social Sciences.
Yeah, okay. Not funded, but anyway. But because this is really crucial. The gas people, the international gas lobbyist, is mobilizing. I mean, it's like you've got the renewables people are really excited about this. The nuclear people are excited, but for different reasons, right? I mean, they gotta hold on to as much turf as they can. And the gas people are totally excited, going around the world and look at how wonderful this opportunity is. The Australians are frightened by the competition from American, shale gas and other, resources production. And this is one, the decision on what kind of gas infrastructure to put in. I mean, you can't make heavy use of gas within Japan unless you put in roughly 2 trillion yen worth of pipe infrastructure, right? And you also have a cost problem. It's about 3 times the cost, isn't it, from the American cost, and about 1.5 times the European cost. And the argument is that if you could create an infrastructure network that links you to, say, the Russians, and broadens your markets, you could get it cheaper. But on the other hand, if you put that in, if you make that decision, it's not domestically produced resource, right? And so you lose these potential gains from having the renewables emphasized. You got the access to gas. Well, Jesus, the pressure is off. We got gas. It's cleaner than coal, right? Well, maybe it isn't, if it's unconventional natural gas. That debate is still spinning around. The supply, possibility of unconventional natural gas remains to be determined. As you know, like in the initial year of exploitation of an shale gas and so forth, it's what do you call that? The depletion rate is about 60 to 70%. So you have to keep drilling wells to keep the pace of production, apparently. And so it appears to be a pretty capital-intensive kind of business. It's got a number of risks inherent in it, just the same as nuclear does, just the same as an option as opting for renewables does. It's got an enormous lobby pushing for it. It's got a number of features, like I said. Geez, you go to gas, you could probably, make a bigger and stronger relationship with the Americans. That's a plus, right? And that's all being thought about and heavily, lobbied for. And how that, the reliance on gas is going to increase, even if you go for renewables, because there's cogeneration where you use maybe a wind thing. Until you get the smart grid, super grid put in place, you would probably match your wind and solar installations. Because they're intermittent power, you probably stick a gas-fired, a small gas-fired facility in there with it. Because if the wind's not blowing, then you fire up the gas thing and you can maintain your power production. To the extent that that happens remains unclear. Because if you put the grid in quickly, well, then you reduce the need for that supplementary role. However, when there's councils of power, does it remain simply a supplementary role, or does it become the new pillar? It's conceivable. If you listen to the talk from especially from Sierra and places like that, you should go in this direction. There's like 300 years, etc., of supply. This is a revolution, man. Get on, right? Well, So that is a very, very important point. I'm glad you asked it. I was trying to stay away from it. This is indicative of how profoundly fluid and important our energy politics, political economy is at present. You choose gas, the IEA says, there's this golden age of gas. There's probably a lot of supply. We believe what Sierra's saying. But on the other hand, if we opt for gas, in this decade, we have to somehow ramp down our emissions or we go to hell, right? This is the IEA calls this the decade of policy. Things like the feed-in tariff and so forth. We have to engineer a transition in this decade. We have to get that going, or we, even by their very, very, optimistic, roadmap, we are in serious trouble. So if you opt for gas in a big way, and unconventional gas turns out not to be, as it's billed, a great deal cleaner than coal, if the methane emissions are really as high as the critics argue, wow. And if it's, depletion rates are as high as people say, there are people who make pretty credible arguments that this is akin to a Ponzi scheme. We've had recent historical experience of an industry that said, geez, what we have in the way of CDOs and CDSs, right? What we have here is a revolution in financial technology. There's no risk with this. And, so gas is going to have a role, but how big that role should be bears, considerable thought and caution. Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Maybe as people are finishing with the question, if you'd like to come up next, you can just walk on out.
Thank you very much for very in-depth analysis, and I'm very touched about the magnitude of the analysis. I'd like to say a couple of things. The first one is the Comparative and also the major exclusive manufacturers, electric companies, will be the same in our society for upcoming 2 or 3 years, because we are not prepared to cope with the smart anything. We are not smart at all in that regard. And because of course, the major government committee functions, the chief is always the prime minister. The chairman is the prime minister of Japan. That's the Japan, how it works. And government agencies will choose to their benefit. But the final voice is always prime minister. Therefore, in my analysis and understanding, the next general election is going to be the major decision-making, turning point for the most Japanese people. And the second one is that the private sector is functioning extremely well right now because they know they have 2 choices. One, leaving Japan, just get away of the hassle in society and finding the alternative. The second one is like those who can move, like beverage industries, they are now busy in installation of their own energy production. And in that regard, Mitsubishi Heavy Industry or Toshiba, they are busy in generating good profit. But the public sector, like myself, an ordinary citizen, can do only one thing, to compete with the neighbors. What percentage we are saving this summer? And at my home, 35 to 40% we could save. Therefore, we are feeling comfortable that we're going to save and continue to save during the winter time. So that's the Japanese mentality, to cope with the natural disaster, and also if the technology is upcoming event, then we like to run. And also the local community chairman is always the city mayor. He has the final word to switch on or switch off Genpatsu. And that is the current upheating event in the local communities. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I agree very much. Thank you for reminding us that that there is an essential conservatism in this society, and those points are well taken. However, the scale of this shock, I mean, we're still, all of us still, watching it unfold. I mean, it's 6 months on, and still trying to figure out how much surface material, for example, is going to have to be scraped away from that region, Fukushima and thereabouts. Something like 100 million cubic meters. Wow. So how this influences those kinds of institutions that you described, right? The effect it has on them. I mean, you've had a pretty profound delegitimation of the establishment already, the Keidanren with its, just keeping pushing and pushing, to get its agenda. No deregulation of utilities. TPP, the way we want it, right? Et cetera, et cetera. The more that goes, the more they push like that, the more they invite backlash, potentially, right? That might happen. But in any event, that larger, political response, that remains to be seen. I mean, you did have some pretty serious demonstrations recently. But to get to the smart thing, that smart isn't going to happen here, I would be very disappointed if that were, to happen, because I think that this country really has a significant contribution to make, right? I mean, this is a horrible tragedy that it's been hit by, but it has this, this Yeah, I don't want to call it a wonderful opportunity. There's an article in Nikkei Business just this month on the 6th that argues this, that this is, reshaped incentives enormously. And things that you couldn't do before are now not only possible, but, essential. And one of them is this smart thing, which I think Japan could do very well. I mean, there's so much latent demand. The vested interest kept the renewables, suppressed for so long that there's lots of low-hanging fruit there to take advantage of, provided you put in the infrastructure. There is so much innovative capacity. There's so much finance waiting for decent returns in this society. There's such a profound sense of crisis, right? That is likely to foster innovation. And when you say it's not going to go smart, well, the projections just in smart meters, basically by 2020, if current projections are correct, the possible global market, excuse me, which means households receiving power, is likely to be satisfied to 60% of capacity. And that's almost going to be a saturated market. That's how rapidly it's diffusing. Sweden is almost 100%. One of the leaders in smart are the Italians, right? You don't tell me that that this country, with the objective needs, that exist, is not going to perform something approaching miracles. Like you say, you're competing with your neighbors to crunch your power demand. Well, how do you measure that, right? If you have a smart meter, wow. And so you can see where, even if you think, well, geez, that's not going to happen. I mean, the inroads are already happening. There is a rollout of smart meters, happening within this country. There are smart grid projects, in operation. And hitherto they've been, contained by the influence of the utilities. But like I said, the rebuild is almost certainly going to go smart, and that becomes an enormous wedge, possibly. So let's hope that it happens fast and in a very diffuse way. Anyway.
Any camera shy people would like to? Well, and you could address your own questions in more detail, but...
Oh, you don't want to hear that.
Well, if there are no other questions, thank you very much, Andrew.
Well, thank you.
This is very